Welcome everybody to our panel on AR and VR technology. What industries will it revolutionize next? I think everyone here is probably familiar with augmented reality and virtual reality technology. You're at a policy conference focused on technology at South by Southwest, I hope. But I think that a lot of people may perceive this only from a consumer standpoint. Right? You may have chased Squirtle and Pikachu around your local park and been using AR and maybe known it, maybe not. You have probably tried an Oculus or a Google Cardboard and experienced a gaming situation or maybe an educational experience on virtual reality. Those things drove this market to be one of the hottest items for Christmas, right? Kids, adults, they want to play with this. It's incredibly compelling if any of you have ever used it. You get sucked in and you want to be able to explore. It's not just an experience where you're taking in information, you are truly interacting within it, which is very compelling. So I don't blame you all for putting it on your Christmas and birthday lists. But I think that there's a lot more to virtual reality and augmented reality technology that we hope to explore today as to where it's going to really have the biggest social, business, economic impacts. And that may not actually be in the consumer market. That may be in industries like healthcare, in industries like education, in industries like corporate communications, or even in mental health, where you could see truly groundbreaking innovations and impacts from augmented reality and virtual reality technologies that may be very different from what you experience on the consumer side. So today, with these three distinguished panelists, I hope we can explore those themes a little bit. First, we have Ann Hobson from the R Street Institute. R Street Institute is a free market think tank that focuses on technology policy in Washington, D.C. and in the states across the country. Ann is a leader on augmented reality, artificial intelligence, virtual reality policy, studied the issues extensively and has written about them in many thoughtful ways recently. So looking forward to what she has to say about where we're going to be going in the future on these technologies. And we have Tim Hwang from Google. As you all know, if you read the New York Times and if you tried your Google Cardboard, it's awesome. But there's a lot more to virtual reality, artificial intelligence, and augmented reality that's happening at Google. Excited to hear from Tim about that. Frankly, if this really is Tim, Tim has possibly automated his own job in the past, although I don't know if he will comment on that. He has also been a leader in crowdfunding, in creating very novel conferences, including one for real, live, living, breathing memes. And I believe you've also created an army of highly intelligent Twitter bots, right?
No comment.
So if they start taking over our Twitter feeds during this conversation and providing real valuable information, don't be surprised. And then we have James Hairston, who is the public policy lead at Oculus. Oculus is a leader in virtual reality technology everywhere from gaming to military training. There's some incredibly compelling stuff happening on the Oculus headset and on the Oculus platform as far as content goes. So very, very excited to hear from James on that. Prior to working at Oculus, he actually worked on relief efforts relating to rebuilding after Hurricane Sandy, and also has spent time working at the Small Business Administration. So to kick things off, we're going to start down at ground level in real life, or as real of life as you can have with virtual reality. And I'll start with you, James, about what is virtual reality and augmented reality currently revolutionizing? You know, we talked a little bit about gaming and those personal experiences, but where else do we already see this technology having a real impact?
Yeah, it's a great question. And you know, I think one of the really awesome things about my work with governments around the world and thinking about sort of public policy and VR and AR is all the ways that folks are looking to apply virtual reality and augmented reality to everyday sort of fields and social challenges. We've already seen great sort of films and storytelling that we're sort of learning how to sort of build new techniques and tell new stories in big ways, and really rely on VR's ability to help us empathize and sort of transport people to new places. But it's really exciting to also talk to museums and cultural institutions around the world who are thinking about how do you digitize some of your records, how do you make sure that collections that are hard to transport or expensive to transport, that they're available all around the world. And some of the projects that we're excited and work on, and when we think about sort of the future of VR at Oculus, looking at the potential for the technology as a computing platform. So thinking about all of the things that we currently do in 2D and all of the sort of computing that we do, everything from programming to word processing, things that are sort of second nature to us on our cell phones or on our personal computers, really thinking about what that would be like in 3D and areas where virtual reality is going to make those applications even easier. We have an Oculus education team that spends a lot of time thinking about what are the things that we're going to learn better in 3 dimensions, in VR and in AR. So I think there are a lot of really exciting applications, a lot of fields, a lot of governments that are looking into what are the ways that we can sort of expand the reach of this technology, and what are going to be the things that we can do more efficiently, or the places where we can learn even more or tell stories even better in VR and AR. So excited to talk through that with this group.
Tim, obviously, Google is no stranger to thinking very big about issues, but I think ironically, people probably know and are most familiar with Google in the VR space from the most simple VR platform out there, Cardboard. Tell us a little bit about why Google decided to go low-tech VR first, and then what you're thinking big about.
Sure, definitely. And I think it is, in fact, the small thing that is the big thing with Cardboard. I think we kind of always think about sort of the history of computing, right? Where when you began, you had these huge machines that were really expensive and were limited to only a small set of uses. But then you sort of had a PC revolution, and basically computing became cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And we saw all these really interesting new applications form. And I think that's what's kind of underlying our direction on things like Cardboard and other projects that we've done since, for example, Daydream, which is basically saying, can we turn mobile into a VR platform? And the game there is to basically say, can we basically take this amazing technology and make it much more democratically available? And in doing so, unleash a bunch of uses that any one company or any one publisher would never come up with. And so I think when you see things like Cardboard, which is almost kind of anti-technological in the way that's built, right? It's just like literally origami with cardboard. I think it's very much a representation of this idea of how do we take these experiences that you can get traditionally have only been able to get with these very expensive kind of products and bring them to a much larger audience.
And having a broader perspective on the entire industry, right? I think sometimes, especially in our technology bubble, we get caught up thinking about the possible. And so when you talk about VR and AR, you think, okay, when do we have this hyper-realistic interaction when I don't know if I'm interacting with a human or an avatar and if I'm in real reality or virtual reality? That probably misses most of the real-world applications in the foreseeable future of the technology. How do you reconcile those two goals of making it relevant now and aspiring to something very compelling in the future, and not getting too lost in trying to achieve that future end goal?
Yeah, so I think that the key word here is going to be experiential. So you listen to the radio and you watch TV, but you experience VR. And what that really means to me, so Vladimir Nabokov, who's a famous writer, he wrote an essay on writing. Writing is an earlier medium, just like VR is going to be the next medium. And he said that writing is powerful in 3 ways. So it enchants, and it teaches, and it also allows you to learn. So I think the key there will be enchanting. So I'm pretty excited. I don't know who's here has seen Lord of the Rings. Anybody? I love Lord of the Rings, huge fan. So in the first scene, Gandalf is riding into town, and there's Frodo sitting by a tree, and he's reading a book. And when I think about what I want to do in VR, one of the things that comes to mind is just being able to enter these scenes and do things within them. So we're going to get to this later, I'm sure, but it really is about presence, and it is about agency. So if I can do an action, read a book, and be sitting there and be Frodo, and Gandalf rolls into town, how cool would that be? And that experiential aspect is going to create a memory that is more powerful than watching that on a television screen.
So essentially what you're saying is that in order to truly enjoy and become immersed in VR, it does not have to be perfect. It only has to be good enough, right, to draw you in. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about what that means? What does a good VR experience entail? How do you technologically make that happen for someone when they are Frodo in that scene where it may be a little bit imperfect, but you still are able to trick the mind into really thinking that you're experiencing Frodo's way of life? How does that work?
Sure. So I think there's a huge difference between 360 videos where you're just standing in a scene that someone took a picture of and you can turn around, And then this idea of agency. So there are a couple ways that you can get that, and one of the ways I'm very excited about is haptics, which are touch-based suits. So you can have a t-shirt that will give pressure to your body when you're moving in VR, and you can also have gloves. And so at CES, great show, want to plug it, you should all go. They had this demo where you were in room scale, which is where there's sensors and you're standing up, and so you really feel with the headset on that you are somewhere else, and it can track your motion. And with those gloves, you were able to pick up things and you were able to throw them. Or in one scene, I just walked up to a table and just cleared it. And it was incredibly powerful to do that. But also, you can throw a ball and it can go forever, because one of the things about VR is you don't have to be confined to the laws of physics or even the laws of time. You can speed up and slow down time. And I can tell you, it's pretty great to throw a ball and have it go forever, because you're like, man, I'm strong.
Well, and it's worth pointing out that, I think, and this is being worked out in VR right now, is this battle between, simulation and realism turned out to be two very separate things, right? Like movies can feel deeply real even though they're not perfect 3D simulations of the world. And I think we're still kind of working out what are the tropes of this genre that will help people kind of navigate a space and kind of evoke or enchant, as Anna was saying.
So since we've gotten onto filmmaking in VR and evoking and enchanting, I want to introduce another emotion that I think VR has got us thinking about, which is empathy. And sometimes in the technology space, we see a criticism that our device gets in the way of human interaction, in the way of human understanding. In VR, I recently watched the Clouds Over Sidra, where you actually are experiencing what it's like to be in a refugee camp. And it's a whole different way of being part of the content. I don't even want to say consuming the content. Can you talk a little bit about the whole new ways that VR can approach storytelling and introduce different emotions that may not have ever been able to be there in another storytelling medium?
Yeah, I guess I can kick things off. A lot of times you hear folks talk about VR and AR, and particularly VR, and bring up sort of the possibility that we all might enter our own little worlds and and sort of not interact with each other. But I think we see a lot of potential first around sort of social experiences, be they tied to filmmaking explicitly or doing things that we like to do on other mediums in VR. But getting back to the point about empathy, some of the most powerful things I've seen are sort of the small interactions and projects that happen when sort of filmmakers take 360 cameras or are beginning to sort of put experiences in VR, all the way up to sort of some of the highest quality and some of the sort of most expensive, let's say, VR experiences, but on the lower end. We pioneered a small program with schools in the Bay Area where we just went to classrooms and said, here are 360 cameras and VR devices. And we wanted students, high school students, to sort of learn how to begin filming in 360 and then create films that really sort of talked about their communities and the things that they were learning. And just that, and I know that's not sort of full virtual reality by any stretch, but just that experience of learning how to develop film in 360 and then put together what were really beautiful sort of 5-minute vignettes, the potential for people to tell stories, to tell them in a meaningful way, and then really put you in their point of view, and whether, again, that involves high-end VR or just 360 photo and video, I think is really compelling, and is really, to me, I think the answer to the questions about, will this sort of technology expand, our ability to understand each other and go new places, and it's really exciting to sort of see at all ends of the spectrum, whether it's tinkerers on one end and high school students who are just learning the technology, to sort of some of the world's great filmmakers and international institutions really pushing the boundaries of storytelling and virtual reality.
Yeah, and I think it's worth emphasizing that we're still early days in terms of the hardware as well, where I think we're limited by hardware and we're limited by connectivity. Yeah. So there's all these social experiences you could imagine designing that are just really difficult right now, because transferring all the data that VR provides from one place to another and allowing people to communicate in VR is like a tough task in of itself.
Yeah, there's two videos that are experiences you can have that I'd like to point out. One of them is a police shooting, and in the police shooting, the perspective changes as you go through this VR experience. So first you're the bystander, then you're the victim, and then you're the policeman. And it becomes clear that most of the situations we're in are gray areas. And so you get to explore, how does that affect you emotionally, and do you really understand the actions that these players took? And then the other one is just, I'm sure you guys have seen like the drunk driving, don't text and drive videos, where you're like sitting in a car and then texting happens and then boom. Well, they have a VR version of that actually drives you into it in a way that is different than watching it on a screen. So you look down and they're your hands, and you have a phone, and that makes all the difference. And then I think that's a very powerful way to, again, empathize with the situation that people can be in.
So we have a very powerful storytelling mechanism. How do we take that leap to getting the story out to a wider audience? Because we are still talking about, in many cases, a fairly expensive or exclusive piece of technology. Where's the industry looking to take these messages? Because we all know that they're very compelling, and we all know that they will have a very big impact in many of the situations that were brought up, but only if they actually are able to be delivered to end users. And I'll let you start with that.
Sure, so adoption is going to be a huge challenge, and I think that it's hard, especially for high-end experiences, which really do draw people in and you get that agency and presence, to be differentiated from experience where you're just with the cardboard. So I think there's a balance to be played between getting those higher-end experiences out there, and then having that low-end experience be someone's first experience, which I think can be very hard to get past that.
Yeah, I think the whole design principle or question that we need to ask is thinking about what is that first experience, right? If you want to call back to history, like what was the first book to get people really hooked on books, right? It's kind of a weird question, but that must have happened at some point. Or like what was the first movie that got people hooked on movies, right? Like that also must have happened at some point, right? And I think there's an interesting question here both about distribution, right? Like what are the platforms that we think will make it possible for people to experience this medium? But there's also this really important question around content too, right? What will be the most accessible thing that will be sort of the first stepping stone into getting people excited about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing I would add, sort of building on that sort of thought question of, what were the first sorts of, what were the hooks, the things that sort of got people really interested in a new technology? I mean, I think the other piece sort of related to that is, and what a lot of conversations with, whether it's cultural institutions around the world or governments, where are all the places where, we're doing, whether it's traditional video or other sorts of broadcasts, where we might sort of say, all right, let's overlay VR and see if in our museums or in our libraries, if there are cool ways to sort of introduce people to these technologies, and sort of speed up the number of stories that are told and the audiences that they reach, and sort of our imagination about sort of what's possible in the medium.
So we've talked a lot about personal use and personal understanding. Do you think maybe people may actually be first introduced to their, sort of aha moment with VR, not at home or in a store, but possibly at work or at school?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think so, right? I mean, if storytelling is really key to this medium, which I think it is, right, then in many ways, I think the fact that it is such a visceral way of expressing ideas may make it actually really ideal in the education context. Now, we have to figure out exactly the right way of kind of making this truly kind of pedagogical. But personally, as someone who's a Montessori kid, right, that whole kind of educational mode is just based on like tangible things. The notion of VR being able to deploy that like in a costless way or very much less expensive way is really exciting to me.
Yeah, to add on to that, I think that job training is another application that we don't think very much about. But for example, Boeing is using augmented reality so that the people that are designing the ends of the wingtips can see where the pieces are supposed to go. So it's like you could actually use this technology to train people in how to be more productive in their jobs. In the cab on the way over here, I was talking to a guy who puts up telecommunications infrastructure, so antennas on top of roofs, for example. And those have to be pointed in a way such that they're aligned with true north. And he was like, it would be so cool if we could just have an AR headset that would show you where true north was. It would save so much time and make me so much more productive at my job. And I thought that was awesome.
Yeah, and I think that raises a very interesting point that we, as people working in VR, whether in industry or in thought, probably won't be the ones coming up with every single relevant application for AR and VR. As makers of this technology, both Google and Oculus, how do you work with people like, let's say, this telecommunications installer to make sure that industries that you may never have thought of in the past are able to seamlessly tap into your technology?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we see is, organically around the world, there are a lot of really interesting and innovative partnerships that sort of spring up. And, everything from the hard sciences to education to, again, storytelling and filmmaking. And so we spend a lot of time, sort of really looking out and seeing where those are coming together, and if there are ways, whether it's lending technical assistance or sometimes, on the public policy side, sort of trying to support and fund with devices or other sort of support, sort of these small projects that really sort of bring together communities of, say, doctors and developers, or what might be chemists and sort of storytellers in VR. So again, I think a lot of this is happening. There are sort of small trade associations all over the globe, meetup groups that really sort of push compelling projects, and then of course actors in the private sector, like Anne mentioned, what's going on at Boeing. So there's a lot of this work, and I think what we try to do is say, well, where can we be additive? Where is it that there's space for us to help really to help really push some of these innovative partnerships. I think the challenge that we see, though, in that is that often you're bringing together communities that, again, in a new technology or new sets of technologies like VR and AR, communities who haven't worked together. So, again, pulling the example of sort of doctors who are building these great new experiences in VR, whether to do health training or other applications, they are just as new as the content and the developer teams at VR, as you would expect. So, there are all of these challenges with seeing an individual project all the way through and then figuring out the right ways to scale that. But, as a company, what we try to do is when we see really great projects like that, we try to be there and support and sometimes provide equipment and other things, but really push these communities to come together and build more of these exciting experiences all over the globe.
So to bring this to life a little bit, would you be able, James, to highlight for our audience one of the most compelling, innovative projects that Oculus has been able to go and work with someone else in a business or educational setting and say, wow, we've really been able to make a big difference here?
Yeah. I mean, and this, again, the partners are really the focus of a lot of the work that we do. But last year, we began working with the Children's Hospital of Los Angeles and two doctors there and their team and a development team around the world on trying to recreate sort of simulations around difficult surgeries and medical emergencies for children. And so they've been working over the course of the last almost year now on sort of putting together modules that can replace what can be expensive mannequin training, both purchasing the mannequins and doing high fidelity simulations. They've looked at sort of taking what the entire emergency room experience is holistically, everything from sort of the stress and the noise, and then working through all of these sort of individual steps that a doctor in sort of these high stakes, low frequency situations has to go through, and trying to create sort of a basic training module that can then be replicated and reduces cost. So this is a project that we're going to be sort of announcing and rolling out over the course of the coming weeks. But work like that and, just trying to seed small projects like that, again, that bring together these diverse communities to solve sort of real world challenges and show that there might be ways to do things that we're doing at cost, in other sectors that could really be reduced and really supplemented by sort of bringing all of these communities together. So more to come there for sure.
And Tim, I certainly don't want Oculus to be the only one dominating the cool news section of this panel. So what's the most compelling, awesome thing that Google has entered into a partnership around VR on?
So I'm really interested in, one of the maybe unexpected applications I can talk about is this interesting intersection that's emerging between AI and VR. So one of the main challenges in a number of AI applications is training a system to behave in the real world. Right, and traditionally the strategy of that has been, okay, we'll go do the thing in the real world, collect information about it, and you can train a system on how to do it. One approach that a lot of researchers are starting to play around with now are basically creating virtual worlds for AI agents to operate in, and then train based on that. And so, yeah, sorry, this is maybe a little bit too much.
No, it's not too much. It's like for everyone, what does that mean?
So basically the idea is, say you need to create a robot that will run a maze, for instance. One strategy could be you physically build the maze and you have the robot run through it many times until it learns how to do it. And that's the way you teach the robot. one mechanism that a lot of researchers are playing with is basically, why don't we create that maze in a virtual world and have a virtual agent run through it many times? And the data that it gets from doing that is very similar to the data that you would get from doing it in the real world. And in doing so, you can actually train these agents virtually. So there's one paper that was released recently where they were able to train a drone to fly autonomously by first training in a virtual world and then allowing that knowledge, basically, to be built into a real robot. And so one of the interesting applications that we've seen, and I think one of Google's strategies in the space is there's partnerships, but there's also open source. So DeepMind, one of the Alphabet companies, has released this thing called Lab, which is basically an open source platform where anyone can kind of experiment with using this sort of methodology. And we're starting to see some really, really interesting results there.
Yeah, I foresee a situation that possibly would be too dangerous to test in real life, particularly, let's say, a military setting.
Sure, I think that's right. And I think, so we talked about this project at last year's I.O., which was kind of a funny one, where we're trying to figure out how to get robot hands to pick up objects. And so the strategy has been like, let's have a bunch of robot hands try to pick up lots and lots of objects. And like that's something that's like really difficult and complicated to set up. But you could imagine setting up virtual environments that make that sort of testing a lot more accessible to a lot more people.
So we've discussed a lot of very compelling technologies, a lot of interesting places that we may be able to go in the future, but you all came to Innovation Policy Day. What is standing in the way of some of the most compelling ideas in VR and AR, whether it's in education, whether it is in healthcare, whether it is in military applications? What is the biggest obstacle? Is it technological? Is it policy? Is it understanding? Is it a combination of these three things? And with the overarching vision of the industry, I'll let you start with that one.
Sure, so I can comment on the policy challenges. So I analyzed Pokemon Go and the reaction of lawmakers to that technology to sort of try to foresee what some of the issue areas are going to be. And I came up with three big ones. So it's cybersecurity, privacy, and safety, I think, are going to be the three. So with safety, for example, with Pokemon Go, you're walking around in the real world and information is overlaid on top of that, and you go to physical locations. Well, the real world's a dangerous place, and that interaction has caused some trouble. So for example, there's a law called Pidgey's Law, named after a Pokemon, in Illinois, where they're trying to compel Niantic, the creator of Pokemon Go, to actually have to comply with removing Pokestops, like physical locations, and there's a fine if they don't do it in a certain amount of time. And so I think like you get those real world, virtual world interactions, and they turn into real policy issues. With cybersecurity, you have data collection. This also has an effect in privacy as well. And when Pokemon Go was released, Senator Al Franken sent a letter to their CEO and was like, hey, you're collecting a lot of data. How are you going to use that? How long are you going to keep it? And asked a lot of questions that got companies thinking about what they're going to have to do about that data.
Anything you guys want to add to that?
I think I'll pick up on the understanding one. I mean, in terms of like these different kinds of categories, where can policy be most effective? And I think that's a big piece of it, right? I think right now, because virtual reality is kind of this science fiction technology, people often think that certain parts of it are very ahead when it's actually behind. And many people think that certain parts are behind when it's actually pretty far ahead. And I think there has to be some work done, I think, in terms of ensuring or encouraging more communication between the people kind of working on the technology and these many applications that we see all over, whether it be medical or education or otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, I think related to that, I think one of the other things is really thinking about, again, all of the uses of VR and sort of technologies that have sort of preceded it, in sort of trying to bring these communities together, whether in education or in health or general computing, really encouraging sort of governments and sort of actors throughout the ecosystem to think about places where we can push basic science research further. Anne mentioned haptics earlier, and sort of all of the hard sciences that go into sort of creating these awesome devices and ecosystems, often driven out of sort of research universities, both in the US and all over the globe. You find that many of these teams, many of the researchers that are working in VR sort of maintain their university affiliations. Many of the projects that have sort of led to some of the breakthroughs, big and small, sort of come from sort of basic science research funding or university funding. So I think thinking about both the places where we are channeling some of the research that drives VR forward, but also, again, as we think about the future of our museums, our libraries? Where are there places where we can sort of begin plugging in VR in sort of new and innovative ways? Because ultimately, I think that sort of work and that tinkering, outside of the private sector as well, is going to push the technology forward in really great ways, and get people, more accustomed and improve sort of our skills development, and that helps everyone in the ecosystem.
Yeah, and from a technological standpoint, like when you're experiencing VR, there are a lot of things that can take you out of that experience that I think need to be overcome. One of them is the cord. I mean, tripping over a cord while you're in a virtual world is really jarring. The same thing goes for knowing that people are watching you outside, if you're part of a larger demo, for example. And I think the biggest one for me was looking down, and in some of these games, they haven't developed legs. So you look down and you have no legs, and it's like the most jarring experience, just like, where'd my legs go, right? I think that these are simple things that you're gonna have to overcome.
All right, so we're about to go to questions, but before we do that, I know that all of you on this panel have been reading a fair bit of science fiction as it relates to AR and VR, possibly in anticipation of this panel, possibly just because you love it. Lightning round, what is your pie in the sky science fiction place that you wish AR could go, VR could go, and it can't get there yet? Anne?
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to mention Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson. In Snow Crash, there's a place called The Street, which is a virtual reality location that everybody wants to go to. It's got expensive real estate, and everyone wants to build there. It's super shiny, as you can imagine. But everyone has their own avatar. And you can make it, because again, there's no constraints on physics, you can make it whatever you want. So people's hair are on fire, or they aren't even people. Like, I'd probably be a turtle that goes really fast, like just for irony's sake. Yeah.
Awesome. Tim?
I mean, I like the idea that some of the technology might get to the point where we can kind of give it some parameters and it generates a world very, at high fidelity based on that. So I would love to be able to say, oh, this movie is depicting this world. I'd like that to be converted into a VR space, and have the machine be able to execute on that.
Excellent. James?
Yeah, I think sort of the possibilities for really advanced haptics down the road, I think that's really exciting to me. The idea that, we'll get to a point where you can sort of pick up a rock, or, I don't know why you'd want to pick up a shard of glass, but like a shard of glass in VR, and, we can begin to recreate, and, with really high fidelity, and there's great work going on in haptics right now, but just high fidelity haptics that, could make everything from picking up a beaker and doing sort of everyday chemistry to sort of deconstructing a house feel like it does in the real world. I think that's going to be really exciting.
All right, with that, we're going to open it up to audience questions. All right, front here, Baron.
Anne, I loved your invocation of Nabokov, and it got me thinking, really, fiction teaches us empathy, to relate to people who are not ourselves, and what you've just been describing is an immersive form of empathy, to be able to relate to people who might have physical disabilities, let's say, or missing limbs, or the police shooting example. I'm just curious from everyone on the panel, both technologically, how well that will work, and then sociologically, how you see that actually being integrated into our lives, our education, the kind of ongoing education, the kind of training and empathy that we all get by reading novels. How do you imagine that will change what it means to be human?
Thanks, Baron, for the question. So, yeah, I think that with empathy in VR, you're going to end up in a place where, for example, you can play a part in a movie. Like, pick your favorite movie, maybe like Monty Python and the Holy Grail. And you can actually be a character in that movie, and they explore that in the book Ready Player One. And I think that that's going to be a super compelling use case moving forward. And you already see Magic Leap, which is a company that's creating augmented reality technology. They have a film studio attached to them. And I think that entertainment aspect is going to really drive that forward.
Yeah, I think like any great medium, I think maybe at some point in the future, we will eventually kind of come to like what the canon of VR experiences are. And I wonder whether or not there will eventually be like the sort of great books, like you're in school and like everybody has to see these 3 or these 5 VR experiences. That seems like something that might happen in the future.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you just look at, we're at the beginning of sort of the great storytelling taking place in VR, and you see what sort of documentary filmmakers are doing and others, and I think we really are going to continue, and as the film techniques and the special styles in 360 film and VR really come into their own, and that canon sort of forms someday, I think we're really going to see the types of experiences that we've experienced on other mediums, in books, in fiction, in film. We're going to see that really come to life in VR, and I think it will become a part of our, perhaps our everyday educational experiences, certainly the way we experience new works of art and learn about the world and history. And I think that's going to be really exciting and sort of baked into in a very natural way.
We have already gone over time, but I want to honor questions, so we're going to do 2 more very quick questions. Purple vest in the back. If you could identify yourself as well.
Hi, my name's Annabelle Blackburn. I work for a social media agency, and so we were super excited about all the conversations going on about VR and AR. And I'm totally on board with all of the comments that we've had today, but some of the responses that I got in my workplace about the uses of VR was, well, what about, say, VR addiction? And what would that mean of people being locked into VR spaces and no longer engaging in the real world? Would that be an issue? And the other question that came up that I would like your remarks on is, you mentioned the interaction of policy, law, and VR and AR space. And we could think about use cases where you could use VR and AR to experience things that are criminal. And how should we respond to someone who goes and, is extremely violent in a VR world and then comes out and doesn't want to engage in that in a real life world until they do? Would this create a block for the development of AR and VR? Should it? Is that a creative, productive question to ask?
Who wants to take that?
Yeah, I can kick off, and I think it's a really great question. Thinking about sort of whether it's safety and all of the things, the sort of within the realms of possibility for all that could happen in VR. How are we making sure that we're thinking about these challenges? And and I think it really starts with some of the principles that we've learned across mediums to date, which is getting to the addiction question, for instance. Really promoting responsible use, just as we would on a mobile phone, on a personal computer, and in other mediums, and really looking at just making sure that we're investing in understanding, when people need to be educated about the right way to use a technology, or if we need to have sort of rules of the road about what is working, what is not, if parents are fully informed about a technology. I think all of those things that we've picked up, over the course of the last few decades in other mediums, they apply to VR. And, and I think all of our companies that are sort of working and building in this space are really committed to making sure that people have that information, and that the software and the hardware and are developed responsibly, and that people can use the technology responsibly. When it comes to sort of uses that we may want to shield and protect people against, I mean, again, I think that some of the same principles apply, which is making sure developers are educated, making sure consumers are educated about what is happening, that there's sort of clear indications of what an experience is and what it isn't. And then if there are things that sort of begin to develop organically that maybe we didn't foresee or didn't plan for, that we're sort of nimble and responsive in creating, whether it's tools or reporting mechanisms, or working to sort of educate people so that we're sort of fixing any challenges that arise that maybe we didn't foresee, because no one can predict everything that's going to happen, or every use, or sort of every sort of tangent for the technology, or the software, the hardware, and I don't think that's problematic. I think that leads to the vast majority of the time really exciting sort of new pioneering uses, but then we just have to have the sort of responsibility and the tools in place to be nimble when that happens, and sort of course correct when people go somewhere that they don't like.
Yeah, so to add on to that, I think that people think that video games are pretty antisocial, but I think that VR can get beyond that. We were talking about artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence can make non-player characters in games seem very real, so you can interact with them in a very natural way. And I think you can use VR to re-socialize people. So one example is if you're having trouble speaking in front of crowds, you can use virtual reality to do public speaking demos where you can practice in front of a crowd, even input a heckler, for example, and that can make you better at your social skills in real life.
So we had a little bit of a miscommunication on time. So consider this a little intermission that we got to ask questions. We're going to resume some questions here on the panel, and then we'll open it back up to audience questions at the end. So apologize for confusion, but this way we got more audience participation, and who can complain about that? But don't worry, we're going to open it back up to questions at the end of the panel here in just a few minutes. And so you guys will have a chance to weigh in. I know I saw a number of other hands out there. One thing I want to then build on that was brought up by virtue of this audience question is the relationship between VR gaming and VR enterprise, let's say. Do they exist on two separate tracks, and you sort of have the gamers that use VR and you have enterprises that use VR? Or is gaming essentially an R&D lab for the rest of VR as we're going to see it deployed across more and more industries? You know, Tim, I think you'd be well equipped to speak to that.
Yeah, so to maybe reveal that I'm a huge nerd, I've been really excited about this game recently on Steam called Shenzhen.io. And Shenzhen.io is basically a simulation of making like electronic circuits. And you basically have to learn a computer language just to play this game, right? And what's amazing is when you get to it, you're like, oh wait, this is just designing circuits as a game. And I think we see lots of examples of that, particularly because the drive to simulation as entertainment in VR is so strong. And so I really do buy the idea that, you know, a lot of these applications that we're seeing in gaming might eventually kind of come back to enterprise.
Is there a policy implication of that? I feel like often you talk to someone who is in the public policy space, and it might be like, oh, gaming. You know, right? It's not considered the same as when you're using a VR technology to map a human vascular system.
Right. Well, I'm not trying to say that they're. Yeah.
No, but I think that there's an important message there to communicate, right? And James, is this something that you operating in very robustly in both of these spaces? Is this something that you think needs to be part of the public policy messaging on the issue?
Ed, I mean, I think there's so much cross-pollination, right? Like what happens on the gaming side can inform, what happens for many of the non-entertainment, non-gaming applications and vice versa. And so, yeah, I mean, I do think it is important to sort of explain that, in both of these fields, they're sort of informing each other, that sort of what happens in schools and universities as well as in gaming studios and in filmmaking shops. Like all of this work, I think, contributes to sort of the next major and minor breakthroughs. And so, to sort of say, gaming is good or is not good for this, and the medical use is and is not good for that. I think a lot of that, starts to fall apart a bit. I mean, because the ecosystem really is reliant on, it is still such a growing and a space where there's so much tinkering and development that it really is reliant on all of these developments. There's sort of not one sector that I see as being more or less important to sort of, the space that we've sort of been talking about that we'll get to years down the road where, the technology is used much more widely and the developments have sort of moved along. So I think it is important to really sort of explain that there's a lot of cross-pollination, and the developments across these fields are extremely, extremely important.
Yeah, and you could actually imagine it going the other way too, which I think is something that's worth pointing out, that like applications that we see in the enterprise space may help to inform sort of games that get produced.
Oh, I think it's a great connection that often is lost, particularly when we're talking about something as vast as VR, when there probably isn't a VR policy, right? You have congressional hearings, I think very importantly, on AR and VR technology. But as Ann pointed out, a lot of the policies that affect this technology are very traditional technology policy debates. Particularly, James, how do you view, in that sense, VR as a policy message? Do you view it uniquely in that you need to be presenting a VR-centric policy to a lawmaker, or do you view yourself as a piece of the privacy debate?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think with VR, I think it's right. I mean, it's such a novel technology. I think the thing that I look at and looking out around the world, is, are we doing the sorts of things? Have we put in place the building blocks so that research teams can go and get running, so that, schools can get running, that doctors can go? And what are the things that we've been talking about, whether they're sort of novel policy questions or some of the sort of longstanding, calls for sort of improving STEM education, let's say, or other things, and where are there sort of some existing challenges that we've identified as sort of needing to sort of help, improve the prospects and, for VR, and then where are there spaces too where we're considering regulation or other things where we may chop off sort of some future development or some future arm of VR's growth. I don't know that that's always sort of readily apparent, but what I try to emphasize in talks with policymakers is really focusing on sort of pro-innovation policy, and that, again, that goes across fields and looking at what's going to sort of help support these emerging teams and research that are doing work in VR and AR, and then sort of assessing some of the things that we've done in recent memory and seeing where did they cause challenges for sort of new and emerging technologies and trying to get past that for the growth of the VR and AR industry.
And Tim, we touched on cardboard earlier, and I think Google's really been a pioneer in bringing VR to the people, for lack of a better way of putting it. One of the exciting things that I often hear about in the VR space is worker retraining. It's a dominant conversation in our country right now about how do we get people who have formerly worked in an industry that no longer may have as many opportunities to rapidly and effectively retrain to work in a radically different industry. A very high technology solution in the form of VR may be one of the ways to do that. Can you talk about the possibilities there, but also probably the major logistical hurdles to making that happen?
Yeah, so I think that's a really exciting possibility. I mean, I think there's two, I would say the TLDR is I think there's a lot of work to be done to get that to work properly. I mean, I think one of them is we've democratized or are working to democratize access, right, to the visuals. But a big part of the retraining will be actually being able to input into these systems very effectively as well. And that is still remaining, that's still kind of a limited thing, right? Thinking about kind of not only being able to experience VR, but also be able to interact with that world in an effective way when your platform is just a folded piece of cardboard. I would say a second thing, though, is that I think we have to think really hard about like what the curriculum is, right? Because it isn't necessarily just like, oh, you pretended to be a welder, so now you can go weld, right? I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done with how does these virtual experiences, maybe even integrate with traditional lecture learning or other things like that. And I think that's still a big part of the picture that needs to be worked out. I think we just need to see more experiments.
Either of the other panelists have anything to add to that, and it's in being such a dominant conversation going on right now? All right. With that, we're going to go back to the people in that case. Here in the front, black blazer.
Yeah, so as you may know, Niantic's been sued in the Northern District of California for trespass and nuisance caused by where the plaintiffs are alleging that just the mere placement of the GPS coordinates equates to a trespass. And as you mentioned, the law in Illinois, and I believe that there's been an ordinance passed in Milwaukee County regarding the same kind of thing. So how can you see the industry mitigating some of that pushback?
Yeah, that's a very hard question. So there are over 4 million Pokestops all over the world, and you can imagine that if they had to ask permission for where each one was going, that this type of application would not exist. So there's a balance that needs to be struck there. One of the things that I advocate for is companies having the flexibility to self-govern. So what Niantic did in that case, they found that some of their Pokestops were in inappropriate areas, Holocaust Museum, also in close to places where there were landmines abroad, and they were able to recognize that and remove that. And so I think you did see them be able to react, but you just mentioned there is already a structure in place to deal with a lot of this, and that is the courts. Nuisance laws, torts, those things are already operating and working to work some of this out.
Green shirt. Yep.
Here you are, sir.
I'm a child psychologist and spent most of my career working with really traumatized children in refugee camps and children's prisons and elsewhere. And I guess one of the things that fascinates me about this is that a child's brain can't differentiate between reality and virtual reality. And I guess one of the things you've been talking about is things like virtual reality will help us build empathy, where psychology tells us that it doesn't actually build empathy, it builds voyeurism. So it looks like empathy, feels like empathy, but doesn't actually change our behaviour. So I guess my question in all of this is, Are any of you working with behavioural psychologists and others to test some of these assumptions as we go, both to maximise the benefit, but also limit what can actually be some pretty significant downsides, particularly where this relates to children and their ability to not really differentiate between reality and almost reality in any way, shape or form?
So yeah, I mean, we think this is a big part of making sure this technology gets developed in the right way and has the good effects that we think it will have. So on my team, I work very regularly with child psychologists, developmental researchers, and people who have been kind of in the haptics and optics space for a very long time. And I think we're not just addressing the kind of psychological questions, but also the many kind of potential physical questions around the technology as well. So this is actually something that we're actively staffing for, and we think it's actually a really important part of our development process.
Yeah, and I'd just add that, you know, I mean, and currently, so Oculus products are 13 plus, but, you know, we do try to think ahead and you know, begin, so the research, behavioral psychologists, I can't say that we've necessarily worked with that community distinctly, but our research teams really are working ahead and sort of thinking about some of the big questions, and collecting data, of course, too, about sort of what is happening, whether it's in, you know, storytelling experiences and gaming experiences, both with the aim of sort of making the technology and the VR experiences comfortable and as safe as possible for everyone. But again, better understanding sort of what are going to be the impacts. So we're still at the beginning of that process, but absolutely, it's on everyone's minds.
Back, green t-shirt.
Thank you, sorry.
Hi, I had a question. I'm in the mapping space, and I wanted to know if you guys have thought about the applications for especially AR, but also VR in wayfinding and navigation, and how to take kind of mapping and navigation from a 2D world to the VR and AR space.
Yeah, actually, I think so. Having played Skyrim and a lot of first-person shooters, where you have up in the right hand of the screen a map that where you turn, it denotes that, and it'll show like other characters on the screen in terms of dots, and then it also has a compass. Like that would be so helpful as an application in real life. I keep getting turned the wrong way on 6th Street, and if I had that compass, that wouldn't happen.
It's not something that, I mean, and I can't speak for every team at Oculus. It's not something that I've worked on specifically, but, you know, I mean, again, I think in our focus in sort of creating a space where software developers and researchers can begin to do work in that field, I mean, of course, Oculus is happy to sort of be a platform that, you know, creates a space where people can experiment, whether it's in mapping or other fields like that. But, I mean, I can't say that I've done any work on that specifically.
Front, black shirt.
Hi, Margaret Rose with a company called Yet Analytics. So I was, as a huge science fiction fan, was particularly excited about the many references to Ready Player One, but then also noticed a lot of points around using VR for media, using VR for training. Those are all very time consuming, so I was wondering what's the longest that you or someone you know have actually been in VR, and then what are the implications of that, kind of given the context of the other things you shared?
I'm fascinated to know too. For me, it's no more than 30 minutes.
Yeah, no, so I've been, I think the longest single use has been maybe like an hour.
Yeah, it's probably somewhere around hour and a half, maybe, for my longest single use. I mean, I think, you know, and the question about sort of if people are maybe say only using it, you know, in sort of shorter bursts, what does that mean for all of these different sort of experience, whether it's training or other things? I mean, and again, I think we'll see whether it's worker training that I know we've talked about, or new media, you know, film and storytelling. I think we will see sort of the form adapt to a lot of the different uses and different communities. You know, maybe designing 10 and 15-minute experiences. Others may be going longer in storytelling. I think there's a ton of flexibility, and we'll sort of see short form, we'll see longer form experiences, and I think there will probably be a healthy range across the board depending on the use case.
Yeah, for me, it's about an hour as well. But I think that one thing that's pretty cool, there's an app called Big Screen VR, and the core user base of this app actually plays for 20 hours a week, which is a lot. But what this app is you're sitting on a couch and then you have your actual computer screen that is then visualized in the virtual space so people can watch YouTube videos together. Or you can give a tutorial on how you can actually work through a problem, like a problem set or something on your computer, or even learn how to use it better. And I think that's actually a really effective application. And so I'm excited to see where that goes.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that people in the market, I think, are waiting to see is whether or not there's a differentiator in terms of hardware here, like whether or not certain types of hardware platforms will just be better for certain types of VR experiences. And I think that's still being kind of worked out as well.
In the back, black t-shirt. And then, Raza, you're next.
I know addiction has been mentioned already, but I was just curious from a policy perspective if you think that self-regulation is sufficient to protect consumers. You mentioned Nabokov, but I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with David Foster Wallace's vision in Infinite Jest, where entertainment has become weaponized because it's so addictively entertaining. Do you think that self-regulation is sufficient for consumer protection in AR and VR?
Yeah.
Oh,
okay.
go ahead.
Yeah, so one of the things that I think in the future is just when are you going to stop using VR? Like, how do you know when reality is and when it isn't? I think we're going to have to deal with this question of what is reality, because you can imagine a future in which many people are living in VR. So Ready Player One explores this a little bit, where people go to school, they have jobs in VR that they're attending, and once you spend that much time in it, we have to question if this is the real reality.
And I would just say, I mean, I think I would take the question, I guess, from a slightly different angle, which is, I think it will be important to, when we identify sort of harms in VR as in any other medium, with our mobile phones or with personal computers, really sort of taking a look at whether or not we don't have the sort of tools or the dialogue or the means to address them. And so, if there are harms that aren't being addressed and they, do represent sort of a serious problem, then I think it's time to sort of have a conversation about, whether or not we need to do more through law and public policy. But really focusing on the harms that we're trying to address, identifying them clearly, and I think as a first step, really saying, all right, let's make sure that we're being responsive when, there are reports of misuse or of challenges, and exploring all of that, trying to address those harms sort of, in a sort of collaborative dialogue first, and again, holding companies and actors across the ecosystem to account if they're not addressing them, and then if that doesn't work, then moving to a place where we say, all right, let's look at more options.
Yeah, that's definitely how we think about it. I mean, and to go back to James's earlier point, I think we're not without precedent here, right? That there have been other media where we have been worried that this would be the case, and so I think it's worth it looking at those historical stories and how we approach those problems as a guide for what we do here.
All right, Raza, now you.
Sure. Hey, so I wanted to ask you about how you're thinking about VR and AR technology affecting different populations. In particular, how you're perhaps thinking about accessibility for disabled communities, both in terms of the challenges they may have to access the technology and sort of the opportunities you might see there for serving those otherwise left out communities.
Yeah, one application that's really cool. So paraplegics, they forget, their brain doesn't remember how to walk, and they're using VR with a brain interface to actually teach them, reteach them how to walk. And it's worked actually at the 2014 FIFA World Cup. The kickoff was done by a paraplegic who was trained through VR to remember what it was like to walk, and those neural connections were able to transfer through an exoskeleton and a lot more work to actual physical outcomes.
Yeah, and I think it's those types of uses that are the really exciting ones. I think sometimes you hear this trope at VR conferences where it's like, oh, well, it's great. Like, if you can't get there, we'll just like give you the VR substitute. And I think we should be worried about necessarily drawing a full equivalence between being able to simulate going to a museum and then actually being there. That being said, I think the kinds of uses I'm really excited about are like these, where it's actually a tool that's actually something that kind of allows people to achieve something even broader than what they were able to do before.
And then just in terms of the sort of everyday development of VR, and I think all of the work that's going into sort of the efficiency of the devices and the experiences will ultimately inform, I think a lot of great work on the accessibility side. So to take something really minor, doing text in VR in general is sort of still a challenge, and there are all of these questions about how to position it properly, and this is, whether in storytelling or in sort of general applications. But as that work continues to come together, I think in terms of just the everyday operation of VR, I think we'll see accessibility move forward as well. There's still so many early days challenges that, across experiences, everyone is trying to work through on the hardware and software side. But accessibility, of course, is going to be immensely important. And as these sort of basic challenges get figured out, I think it will also push forward a lot of the work on accessibility in really great ways.
All right, with that, we actually are done with the panel this time. So appreciate you bearing with us. Actually, you got to ask more questions, so I don't know that I need to apologize for that. But thank you again for coming. One last plug, entirely unrelated to AR and VR, but very important to technology, to the state of Texas, and to our member companies at Consumer Technology Association. None of you have taken an Uber or Lyft while you were here. Almost every one of you who came last year probably did. If you valued that experience and want to be able to use those services here in Texas, we are working with the legislature to make sure that they get legalized throughout the state. That means Austin as well. You can text on your phone RIDE, the word RIDE, R-I-D-E, to 52886. That's RIDE to 52886. And that will let the legislature know that you care about this issue and that you want to see ride sharing back in Texas. So thank you again for helping with that campaign. Thank you again for coming to this panel. Really appreciate it.